5 million people are about to run out of water. Right now, a major American metropolis, the ninth largest in the country, gets over 70% of its drinking water from a single artificial lake. And that lake is starting to disappear. Again. During a historic drought in 2007, Lake Lanier dropped an apocalyptic 20 feet, revealing long submerged roads and the foundations of forgotten towns. The city of Atlanta was weeks, maybe days, from catastrophe. If this story already has you thinking about what comes out of your own tap, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The geography of water is a story that affects everyone. So, the city built a colossal $280 million emergency backup, a deep rock quarry filled with 2.4 billion gallons of water. It was supposed to be their insurance policy, their guarantee. But here's the part they don't advertise. That massive reservoir would supply the city for just 30 days. Not a year, not 6 months. 30 days, and then the taps run dry. And now, as a new drought grips the state, the lake is falling again. And a quick, urgent request. A huge number of people who appreciate these deep dives forget to subscribe. If you value this kind of reporting, please take 1 second and hit that button. It's the single most important thing you can do to keep this channel going. Okay, let's begin. The real question isn't whether Atlanta can survive another 20-foot drop. It's whether the city was ever meant to exist there at all. Atlanta is a geographical anomaly, a major city built on a foundation of terrible luck. It sits near the very top of the Chattahoochee River Basin, meaning it drinks first, but it also has very little upstream water to draw from. It's perched on the Piedmont Plateau, a region defined by a sprawling, impenetrable layer of solid granite just beneath the soil. While other cities across the country can drill deep wells into vast underground aquifers, when the rains stop and the rivers run low, Atlanta cannot. There is no secret reservoir underground. There is no plan B hiding in the geology. There is only the rain that falls from the sky, the water that gathers in the river, and the single man-made lake that holds it all. This singular vulnerability is the core of Atlanta's existence. A city of millions, a hub of global commerce, tethered to the fate of one river, one dam, and one reservoir. For decades, that arrangement felt stable, an engineering problem that had been solved. Then the population exploded, the climate shifted, and the water began to run out. The city's entire future now hinges on a body of water that was never intended for the purpose it now serves. A lake named for a Confederate poet, built on top of a violent, forgotten history. A reservoir that is not just a water source, but a battleground. And that battle is just getting started. The story of Lake Lanier begins not with water, but with power and control. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers identified a stretch of the Chattahoochee River in northern Georgia as a prime location for a new dam. The project, Buford Dam, was authorized by Congress, with 3 specific goals in mind: generating hydroelectric power for a growing region, enabling commercial navigation downstream, and controlling the devastating floods that periodically ravaged the area. Its construction began in 1950. It took 6 years. When the gates on the newly completed dam finally closed in 1956, the waters of the Chattahoochee began to back up, slowly drowning 50,000 acres of rolling hills and farmland. Drinking water was not on the list, not in the original federal mandate, not in the engineering blueprints. The idea that this reservoir would one day become the primary, non-negotiable water supply for a future metropolis of 5 million people was not part of the calculation. It was an afterthought, an improvisation born of frantic necessity decades later as Atlanta grew far beyond what its original planners had ever conceived. The creation of the lake was a violent reshaping of the landscape. More than 250 families were displaced, their homes and farms bought out under eminent domain, many for prices that left them with little to restart their lives. 15 businesses were shuttered. 20 cemeteries were painstakingly relocated, but local legend, and a fair amount of evidence, suggests that countless unmarked graves were simply swallowed by the rising water. An entire world was submerged. Paved roads, brick foundations, an old motor speedway, they all sit down there right now, in the dark, encrusted with silt. But the darkest chapter of the land beneath Lake Lanier happened long before the dam was even a blueprint. The area flooded by the reservoir included what was left of Oscarville, a once thriving, predominantly black farming community in Forsyth County. In September of 1912, after a white woman was assaulted and murdered, white mobs, inflamed by racial hatred, unleashed a campaign of terror. They lynched suspects, burned black churches and businesses to the ground, and systematically drove nearly every single black resident, almost 1,100 people, out of the county. They fled for their lives, forced to abandon their land, their homes, their entire existence. Oscarville was ethnically cleansed. For over 40 years, the land that used to belong to a prosperous black community was occupied by white residents. Then, in 1956, the waters of Lake Lanier rose and erased what was left of it. The government did not flood a black town. The story is much worse than that. The government flooded the land where a black town had been terrorized out of existence decades earlier. It's a chilling thought. If you agree, let us know in the comments. That dark history has fueled the lake's reputation as a cursed, haunted place, a place that has claimed nearly 700 lives in drownings and accidents since its creation. A watery grave built on a foundation of violent dispossession. For a time, none of that mattered to the growing city to the south. Atlanta was booming. The 1960s, 70s, and 80s saw an explosion of growth that turned a regional hub into an international city. With that growth came an insatiable thirst. The city began pulling more and more water from the Chattahoochee, and by extension, from the massive bucket the Army Corps had conveniently placed upstream. It was a simple, effective solution, and it was deeply, fundamentally illegal. Or so, 3 other states would come to argue. The quiet siphoning of Lake Lanier's water for Metro Atlanta's growth lit the fuse on what would become the Tri-State Water Wars, one of the longest, most expensive, and most bitter water disputes in the history of the United States. The year 2007 was the moment the theoretical became real. Decades of simmering tensions and quiet overuse finally collided with a force no one could control: the weather. An exceptional drought, the worst in a century, settled over the southeastern United States. The rain simply stopped falling. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the lush green landscape of Georgia turned brown and brittle. Rivers shrank to trickles, and Lake Lanier began to vanish. The numbers were staggering. The lake's target elevation, its full summer pool, is 1,071 feet above mean sea level. By late 2007, it was dropping a foot a week, then more. The shoreline retreated, exposing vast expanses of red Georgia clay that baked and cracked in the sun. Multi-million-dollar homes with lakeside docks suddenly found themselves overlooking a dusty, barren canyon. The docks sat stranded, their ramps pointing down at nothing, 15-20 feet above the waterline. The billion-dollar recreation economy that had grown around the lake, boating, fishing, tourism, ground to a dead stop. Marinas went bankrupt. The lake looked like a drained bathtub. On December 26, 2007, the lake hit its all-time record low, 1,050.79 feet, over 20 feet below full pool. It was an apocalyptic scene. The bones of the pre-lake world began to re-emerge. Pieces of the old Gainesville Speedway, the foundations of submerged farmhouses, a near-complete stretch of an old paved road. It was a geological scar, a stark visual testament to how much water was gone. But for the 5 million people in Metro Atlanta, it was more than an economic disaster or an eerie spectacle. It was an existential threat. The city's water intakes, the pipes that pull water from the lake, are positioned at fixed elevations. As the water level dropped, it came perilously close to falling below the lip of the highest intakes. Had that happened, the pumps would have started sucking air. The flow of water to the city's treatment plants would have slowed and then stopped. Panic set in. The governor of Georgia held a public prayer for rain on the steps of the state capitol. Atlanta implemented draconian water restrictions. You couldn't water your lawn. You couldn't wash your car. Restaurants could only serve water if a patron specifically asked for it. This was a major American city in the 21st century, rationing water like a desert settlement. The situation exposed a terrifying vulnerability that had been ignored for decades. Atlanta, a city of millions, had only a 3-day emergency backup supply of water. If the flow from the Chattahoochee was ever seriously interrupted, for any reason, the entire metropolis would be dry in 72 hours. Not a shortage, not restrictions, gone. It was a wake-up call delivered with the force of a battering ram. The 2007 drought finally seared the reality of the city's precarious position into the minds of its leaders. An engineering solution had created the city's dependency, and now only a new, even more audacious feat of engineering could hope to save it. If this deep dive is giving you a new perspective, do us a huge favor and hit the like button, and maybe share this with one family member who takes tap water for granted. It's a conversation worth having. The 3-day backup supply was an indefensible risk, a ticking time bomb at the heart of the city's water infrastructure. So Atlanta embarked on one of the most ambitious urban water projects in recent memory. The plan was both simple and ingenious. Convert a massive, defunct granite quarry on the city's west side into a colossal emergency reservoir. This was the Bellwood Quarry, a familiar landmark to residents, known for its steep rock walls and deep, turquoise water. It was a gaping hole in the ground, 400 feet deep. The city, under the leadership of then Watershed Commissioner Joanne Macrina, launched a $280 million plus project. It wasn't just about filling a hole with water. It was about connecting it to the city's 2 main water treatment plants with a tunnel 5 miles long and 10 feet in diameter, bored through the same solid granite that cursed the city's geology. This tunnel would allow the Department of Watershed Management to pump water from the Chattahoochee River into the quarry during wet periods, banking it for a dry day. Then, if the river supply were ever compromised by a drought, a chemical spill, or an act of sabotage, they could reverse the flow, pulling water from the quarry to keep the city alive. When the West Side Park at Bellwood Quarry Reservoir was finally filled and brought online, officials announced a monumental achievement. The city's emergency reserve had been expanded from a terrifying 3 days to a much more comfortable 30 days. Lillian Govis, a communications director for the department at the time, put it plainly. By filling up the quarry, we remove our city from the risk of losing our water supply. It was a triumph of engineering and forward-thinking policy. 2.4 billion gallons of raw water, sitting in a protected reservoir, ready at a moment's notice. A 30-day cushion. But here's the uncomfortable math. A 30-day supply is only a 30-day supply. It's an emergency buffer, not a long-term solution. The 2007 drought didn't last for 30 days. The dry conditions that precipitated it lasted for months, even years. In a prolonged, multi-year drought scenario like the one that crippled the region before, that 30-day clock would run out with shocking speed. The quarry was a brilliant, necessary band-aid, but it was still a band-aid on a gaping wound. It didn't create new water. It just created a slightly larger bucket to hold the same finite supply. It was a survival strategy, not a sustainability strategy. And while Atlanta was busy building its bunker, the war over the water itself was escalating to the highest court in the land. The fight officially began in 1990. Alabama, watching Atlanta's explosive growth and its increasing withdrawals from Lake Lanier, sued the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Alabama's argument was sharp and direct. The Corps was allowing Atlanta to hoard water that was supposed to flow downstream, water that Alabama needed for its own cities, its industries, and to cool its power plants. Florida chimed in soon after, with an even more desperate plea. The reduced flow from the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers, which merged to form the Apalachicola River, was starving Apalachicola Bay, a delicate and once bountiful estuary on the Florida Panhandle. For generations, that bay had produced some of the finest oysters in the world. It was the lifeblood of an entire community. As upstream water retention increased, the salinity of the bay skyrocketed. The oyster population crashed. By the 2010s, the historic fishery had completely collapsed. Florida blamed Georgia directly. It was a simple, brutal equation. Atlanta's continued growth was being paid for by the death of Florida's oyster industry. For over 30 years, the 3 states, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, were locked in a series of punishingly expensive, excruciatingly complex legal battles that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The core of the argument was the original purpose of Buford Dam. Was Lake Lanier just for hydropower and navigation, as the downstream states argued? Or had its purpose evolved to include being the primary water source for a major American city? In July 2009, a ruling landed like a Richter-scale earthquake. Senior U.S. District Judge Paul Magnuson, a Minnesota judge brought in to be a neutral arbiter, issued a devastating opinion. He ruled that Atlanta's use of Lake Lanier for water supply was, in fact, not authorized by Congress. He gave Georgia 3 years to stop its withdrawals, or to get an act of Congress to formally authorize them. The ruling carried the implicit threat that Atlanta could, in theory, be completely cut off from its primary water source. Gil Rogers, an attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center, called it a resounding wake-up call. Judge Magnuson himself wrote presciently, "The problems faced in the ACF basin will continue to be repeated throughout this country." Panic erupted in Georgia. The state's economy, its future, its very survival, were suddenly in legal jeopardy. An appeals court eventually overturned Magnuson's ruling in 2011, finding that water supply was implicitly part of the Corps' mission. The legal battles raged on for another decade, culminating in a 2021 Supreme Court decision in Florida vs. Georgia. The court, in a unanimous decision, ruled largely in Georgia's favor, stating that Florida had failed to prove with sufficient evidence that Georgia's water consumption was the direct cause of the oyster industry's collapse. It was a monumental victory for Georgia, and for Atlanta. The city's right to drink from Lake Lanier seemed, at last, legally secure. The war appeared to be over. Georgia had won. But winning a legal war against your neighbors is not the same as winning a war against physics, and a new crisis was already brewing, this one from a completely unexpected direction. The very agency that Georgia had fought alongside, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, was about to become its next great threat. And yes, I know I'm asking again, but if you've made it this far and haven't subscribed, we're basically best friends now, and you're legally obligated. Just kidding. But it really does help us make more of these deep dives. Fast forward to April 2026. The legal victory feels like a distant memory. A stubborn high-pressure ridge has locked itself over the southeast. The rains have stopped. 100% of the state of Georgia is officially in a state of severe to exceptional drought. Sound familiar? Water levels in Lake Lanier, which had enjoyed several years of healthy recovery, begin to slide. 1 foot, 2 feet, then 4, then 5 feet below full pool. A level 1 drought response is declared. The headlines start appearing, tinged with the panic of 2007. The slow-motion car crash is happening all over again. 5 million residents in the metro area watch the lake-level reports with a growing sense of dread. The ghost of the 20-foot drop looms over every dry forecast. The 30-day backup in Bellwood Quarry feels less like a comfort and more like a stopwatch. But this time, there's a new twist. A new existential threat that has nothing to do with a lack of rain. It has to do with barges. While Georgia was fighting Florida over oysters, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was quietly moving forward with a century-old mandate, maintaining commercial navigation on the lower Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River system. In June 2026, the Corps initiated a project to restore reliable passage for heavy commercial barges moving goods through Alabama and into Florida. It sounds innocuous, but it's a death sentence for Lake Lanier's water levels. Floating heavy barges requires deep river channels, and creating deep river channels requires one thing: releasing massive amounts of water from the dams upstream. The main bucket for the entire system, the reservoir holding 66% of the ACF basin's total storage capacity, is Lake Lanier. To make the river deep enough for barges in Alabama, the Corps has to open the gates at Buford Dam and drain Atlanta's drinking water supply. Even in the most severe droughts, the Corps is federally mandated to release a minimum of 387.6 million gallons of water through Buford Dam every single day. That water is for downstream environmental needs and to maintain river levels. Now, add on top of that the colossal volumes needed to float commercial barge traffic. The demand is unsustainable. It pits the drinking water for 5 million Atlantans directly against the economic interests of a handful of downstream shipping companies. Georgia won the war against Florida and Alabama, only to find itself in a new conflict with the federal agency that holds the keys to the dam. The very body that created the lake is now pursuing a mission that could drain it, irrespective of drought conditions. It's an impossible, infuriating catch-22. The victory in the Supreme Court secured Atlanta's straw into the lake. It did not secure the water level inside it. The city has a legal right to drink from a bucket that the federal government is now planning to empty for a completely different purpose. The situation is fundamentally untenable. A growing metropolis built on solid granite, with no groundwater to tap, a single aging reservoir that was never designed for its modern purpose, a 30-day emergency backup that offers psychological comfort but no long-term security, a decades-long legal war won on paper, but now undermined by a new federal project, and hanging over it all, the increasingly volatile climate, which delivers droughts that are more frequent, more intense, and last longer than ever before. The 20-foot drop in 2007 was not a once-in-a-lifetime anomaly. It was a preview, a dress rehearsal for a future where water is the single most contested resource. Atlanta's story is not a cautionary tale. Not yet. It is the story of a city locked in a permanent state of crisis management, lurching from one existential threat to the next. They built a quarry to survive a drought. They won a court case to survive their neighbors. But you can't sue the weather, and you can't easily defy a federal mandate from the agency that controls the flow of every drop you drink. The question is no longer whether Atlanta can survive its geography. The question is whether our modern systems of law, engineering, and politics are capable of managing a resource that we have taken for granted for a century. The tunnel to Bellwood Quarry is built, the legal precedent is set, but the lake is still falling. Somewhere beneath the surface, under the murky water, the ruins of Oscarville sit in silence, a silent testament to the fact that what is built can be erased, and what is taken for granted can disappear with shocking speed. The clock that started ticking in 2007